Well, good evening, everyone. There's a lot of everyone here. My name's John Highbush, and I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and I just want to thank everyone for coming this evening. What I would like to do, okay, they're asking you to turn it up a little bit. There you go. Is that okay? Wow. Is that okay? Dana is traveling with a guest that I would like to come up and assist me with the Pledge of Allegiance, Macy Scheiberg. Now, where is Macy? There she is. If you'll come up, Macy, and join us. There you are, Macy. There's the flag. If you please stand and join us for the Pledge of Allegiance in honor of our men and women in uniform around the world who are protecting our freedoms every day. Macy, here's the flag.
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Macy. Before we get started tonight, there's another special guest that I'd like to recognize, and that would be Mr. Peter McMahon, the illustrious husband of one Dana Perino. Peter? Well, while we find ourselves on this beautiful evening at the Reagan Library, if I may, what I'd like to do is steal a line from President Franklin Roosevelt. He said of those tasked with giving remarks like this, and when you're introducing a very important person, in this case Dana, that you should, and I quote, be sincere, be brief, and be seated. Given I'm the one who gets the chance to sit with Dana and talk about her new book, I tend to be very fast, but only after, as President Roosevelt suggests, also very sincere. Like many of you here, I've had the chance to get to know Dana from afar through her outstanding work on The Five at Fox News. As the co-host of the show, there is no doubt that Dana is a key reason it has achieved such remarkable success over the past few years. Millions of people tune in each day to hear the banter back and forth from all of the five. But there is a fairness and a civility and a charm that Dana exudes, so that even the most partisan of people would find it impossible to ignore her. Before the five, Dana's work as the press secretary of President Bush 43 set her apart from so many who have served in that role for previous presidents in the past. Dana, I want you to notice how easily I used alliteration there. If you are ever looking for the five to become the six, I'm just saying. Okay. It's no secret to anyone, particularly those who have read Dana's book, that the White House press corps can be an unruly crowd. When one can hear a pin drop in the press room, it's a sign that the person speaking on behalf of the president, as Dana did on any given day, commands the utmost of respect from a very wild bunch. And while I've never had the chance to work directly with Dana in Washington, I consider myself a true authority on what makes that city work or not work, depending on your point of view. I have a theory about the people who occupy seats of power in our nation's capital, and you might have heard something similar to this in the past. In Washington, D.C., when it comes to achieving success, it eventually boils down to who you know or what you know. They both matter. More often it's the case that who you know is plenty enough to keep you around the town for years, as one person or another can help you keep yourself in high places. But eventually, especially where the highest pressure jobs and the greatest skills imaginable come into play, it is what you know that really counts. All the connected people in the world are not able to help you when you are standing at a podium all by your lonesome, representing the President of the United States. Now, Dana Perino is that very, very rare combination of the best of who you know and what you know. I am certain that the who she knows is a function of her genuineness. You will not meet a more friendly and gracious person who, in her own words, values respect and dignity above all else in her treatment of others, no matter what their station in life. What she knows is so capably demonstrated every day as we tune into the 5 or remember her days serving our 43rd president. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a conversation with a dear friend of the Reagan Library, Dana Perino. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Dana, this will just take half an hour, doesn't it?
If you've read the book, you know that podiums kind of can be hard for me.
Yeah.
I need a little box.
So Dana, the way I like to work this is I will ask 10 incredibly smart questions. You will reply, and when we finish with that, then we're going to open it up to you in the audience to ask questions of your own. And when we do go to you, if I just could ask, raise your hand, and there'll be people in the aisles with microphones. If you could just make sure that you've got a mic in front of you before you speak, that'd be great. First question, Dana. You know, in my office upstairs, there are dozens and dozens of books on my shelf written by people who have done one great thing or another for the country, people who have worked in Washington and made a real mark for themselves. But not a single one of them have titled their book in such a positive way as you have. I don't know if you remember, but the title of your book is "And the Good News Is." And I was wondering, why did you pick that?
Thank you, John. It is such an honor to be here and to be able to talk about this book, which was really a lifetime in the making. And the reason I call it "And the Good News Is," well, there's several reasons. The first is that I was a kid of the Reagan era. Okay, I was born in 1972. My first political memory was of President Ronald Reagan's inauguration. And I remember being in our house in Denver, Colorado, with the green shag carpet, a television where, Macy, you actually had to turn a knob, okay, to change the channel. And we had energy-efficient window shades because of in the 70s when Jimmy Carter put that through. But I remember sitting there watching it, and my grandmother said, "That Ronald Reagan sure has a head of hair." Earlier today when we were going through the line, and I saw the picture of the dictators, right, and the Ayatollah, I was so scared of the Ayatollah when I was a kid, and I truly believed it was Ronald Reagan who would protect me. When we went through the Just Say No exhibit, the First Lady, Nancy Reagan's exhibit, I said, I was that kid. I never tried drugs. And Just Say No, I know it doesn't work for everybody, it worked for me. And so I was thinking about the title, it actually goes back to another thing of Ronald Reagan, which is the optimism and the belief in carrying yourself with dignity and respect, with serving others in some way, in whatever way that might be. And some people choose to take on the hardest job, which is to run for president. What I did was not a tenth as courageous as that. The reason I chose the title is I felt like my life has been so blessed, and every time I try to plan something out, something else happened, such as meeting my husband Peter on an airplane. And that chapter is chapter 2. It's called Love at First Flight. The day that I got the job as press secretary was the day I planned to resign from the White House. And I went in to say I was going to resign, and Ed Gillespie said, "Do you mind if I go first?" And I said, "Sure." And I sat back, and he said, "The president would like to make you the press secretary on Monday." So I sat back, and I never told him that I was about to resign until he read the book in May. So several things have happened along the way that for me, the good news is that my life is that every time I tried to plan something, God had a better plan for me. But the more practical reason of why I chose the title is that when I worked on Capitol Hill, I was the press secretary for a congressman, and I thought that's all I would ever want to do. Well, I would have to go in and talk to the boss sometimes and tell him that the Denver Post had called, and my boss at the time, Holly Probst, who was our chief of staff, she said, "Remember, when you go in to see the boss, it's not to tell him that everything went perfectly well. You go in to see the boss to say, there's a problem and here's how we plan to solve it. So it's bad news first, followed by good news." So when I went to the Oval Office to tell President Bush that something or other was happening, usually it was that the New York Times plans to run tomorrow, some sort of negative piece, I would always end it by saying, "And the good news is, because I wanted President Bush to want to see me again."
Oh, that is great. You know, Dana, from reading the book and learning about your background and working on Capitol Hill and in the communications arena, moving on to the White House, I wondered, maybe especially for the younger people here, do you think all this came about because you planned it out, you know, every little step, and that's why you got to be successful? Or was it just more happenstance than that, and you took advantage of various moments? What would you say it really came down to?
One of the reasons I wanted to write the book, there's basically two things I was trying to do. One is to fill in a gap of history when it came to the personal side of George W. Bush, because historians are going to continue to write about policies and politics, and in fact, he told us not to worry about it. In his last year in office, as we got ready for those final interviews, he said, "Last year I read 3 books about George Washington, and if they're still writing about the first president, then the 43rd doesn't have a lot to worry about." But I worried about it. And I felt like history was missing this piece, because a historian will never be able to tell you what it was like to have the commander-in-chief become like a second father to you, or to witness acts of bravery and kindness and despair and slights against him. And so that was one of the reasons I wanted to write it. But the other reason is I've had this opportunity to do some pretty amazing things. I was the first Republican woman to be press secretary of the United States. I have a chance to be on the 5, so I have a visible job. So a lot of people ask me for advice, especially younger people, or their parents ask me. And this is what I think young people are looking for right now. They want the GPS for their career. Okay, they want to know, when do you turn right, which lane to get in, how long are you going to stay on this road, and then you're going to take a left, and you're going to go down that road and take this exit. And they are worrying themselves to death because they want a very specific plan. And what I wanted to do with this book is to say that there are things you can do to set yourself up for success and personal happiness and fulfillment. But there are also those things that just happen to you where you have your eyes and ears open at all times. When I met Peter on an airplane, I hadn't dated anyone in a long time, and in fact, in D.C., what I said was, "It's not Muscle Beach," okay? I didn't date hardly anybody, and then I meet this guy on an airplane, and he's 18 years older than me, and all these things happen, and my career takes off at a point when I had never met George W. Bush when I met Peter, so we've been together 17, 18 years now, and my favorite piece of advice in the book is that choosing to be loved is not a career-limiting decision. And I couldn't have done any of this without him. And so what I hope that young people take away from this is that there is no roadmap that I will be able to give you. It just will not happen. You have to make that decision on your own, but that you should embrace adulthood. And you will get through the thing that I call for young women in the audience. I said that we all went through a quarter-life crisis. You're 24, 25, you think, oh my gosh, everything I dreamed about as a girl isn't happening, it's not coming true. And you readjust, and then you get through it, and when you come out on the other side, you realize that all of those dreams actually led to that moment where you can find what I call at the end of the book, what I've been searching for my whole life, which is productive serenity. And I think that if you can find that, that's what God wanted for you. And looking at the last video today at the library, when Ronald Reagan says he wants to be remembered for having listened to and inspired your best hopes and not your fears, Washington can actually be a place where they play on fear and division, and it's distasteful, and none of us like it. But it takes a very special person, somebody like a Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush, in my opinion, and a George W. Bush, 43, that always turned the other cheek. And so I hope that young people realize that choosing civility is a better way to achieve professional success, but to also find that productive serenity that was meant for us.
Well played. You know, I'm sure, Dana, in your time at the White House serving President Bush, there were some very tough moments. It's hard to imagine that there weren't.
It wasn't the easiest.
Yeah.
You'll recall.
And are you able to isolate it down? And boy, this one in particular was the most difficult issue or situation I had to face.
There were a few choice moments. I start the book with a story called The Black Eye of Baghdad, because a lot of people they will remember that the shoes that were thrown at President Bush during that press conference, but no one knows that I'm the only one who got hurt. I got hit in the face with the steel arm of the boom mic, and I had a black eye for the last 6 weeks of the administration, which some people think is quite ironic. But I think that the hardest thing that I ever dealt with, something I've actually not spoken about at any of these book signings, it's in the book, but at the convention that took place in Minneapolis in 2008, President Bush was scheduled to speak. Now, this is a guy who was never able to celebrate either of his presidential elections on that night. One was the recount that took 36 days. The next, in 2004, was about 36 hours later before John Kerry would concede, when it was obvious that 43 had won re-election. Then you get to the convention, and things had been hard, but things had turned around. And then we get in the middle of a financial crisis. And John McCain was facing headwinds that were very tough for anybody to overcome. It's hard for any presidential party or political party to win a third term of the White House. And the economy's bad, the war's bad, and people like the fresh and the new, and there's President Obama as hope and change. But we were going to go to the convention, and it was in Minneapolis, and then the NOAA, the weather service, says there's a hurricane bearing down on the United States. And it looked like it was going to be a big one, and it was going to hit right again that special spot of America that likes to attract hurricanes, Galveston to New Orleans. And we were looking at the weather forecast, and we had told the campaigns up in Minneapolis, the McCain-Palin campaign, that we were prepared to go, we were ready. They just had to say the word that we were all set to go. Secret Service cleared us, we were able to fly. And the call never comes from the McCain and Palin campaign for 43 to take off from the White House in order to make it to give his speech at the convention. I thought it was a huge mistake by the McCain and Palin people, but it was the decision that they made. So the president instead gave a speech from the Cross Hall of the White House, and at the end he came down towards where I was, and there were some live screens of the convention floor, and he was wiping off his makeup, the powder from the interview, or the television appearance, and he quietly said to me, "Do you think they know they're insulting me?" And I said, I never lied to him, but I hurt for him, and I said, "Yes, sir, I believe they do." But I remember in that moment, and for as hard as that might have been to feel at that instant, it actually was freeing for us. Because from then on, I didn't care about the campaign at all. We just focused on what we had to do at the White House, That was, theirs to win or lose, and I wanted them to win, but I remember feeling such a bond that would last beyond a presidency. And I'm glad that I had a chance to feel that about somebody else.
Okay, so then I can't let that go without you saying, or what would you say was just your most delightful moment? What is it that stands out to you as being the best of your experience there?
Can I say two?
Sure.
Okay. Because while you're asking me that, I'm like, I have one that I really want to talk about, and there's a second one. One happens when I'm deputy press secretary, and one of the pieces of advice in the book that I give is always take the deputy job, young people. Because that's when you have to work holidays, weekends, and nights, but that's when you get to know the boss, and you get to know the job. And so I remember it was one of my first trips to go on Marine One with President Bush. I was the accompanying press secretary for a night when he was going to see the Boy Scout Jamboree. It was taking place in Virginia. Like this, I had really important assignments. I was so nervous about getting on Marine One, and you've seen how small it is because if you've had the tour here. I didn't know where I was supposed to sit, and I didn't want to irritate the president. So Scott McClellan, the press secretary at the time, drew me a diagram of Marine One. And he said, when you get on, take a right, and you sit right there unless he tells you to sit there. So I memorized that, and we go down. The Boy Scouts go crazy. They loved it, and he loved it. It was a June evening. And on our way back, the president sitting there, and he wants to get to know me. So he's asking me about my family and everything, and I'm trying to be quiet, and I don't want to get in his way because I don't want to irritate him. I don't know why I thought he'd be irritated, but I didn't want to take up any space, try to shrink. And he had a box lunch, or a dinner, that the White House mess had sent for him on the plane, and the aide hands it to him, and he opens it up, and he starts undoing the package, and he goes to hand me a sandwich, and I said, oh, no, thank you, I couldn't. He said, come on. So I said, okay, and then we sat and ate peanut butter and honey sandwiches and Sun Chips, plain, no cheddar, he doesn't like the cheddar kind, and apples and Diet Cokes, and we sat, it was probably a 35-minute ride, and the sun was setting in Virginia, and I always think that was a moment that I thought nothing would ever top that. But another moment in the book that I think is important is as we get towards Father's Day. I think it's worth mentioning. I write about my early childhood because when I wrote the book to write about 43 and all the advice for young people, my editor said, you can't just show up at age 35 as the press secretary. Like, what happened before that? So I had to go back, and one of the things I talked about was my relationship with my dad. And when I was a little girl, I missed him terribly all the time, and he had grown up on a ranch, and so when he'd go to work, my mom would give me this cassette player, and I would play a tape that my dad had recorded for me, and he'd say, what does a cow say? And what does a horse say? And I'd play it over and over. And then when I was 8 years old, he started a tradition with me where I had to read the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post before he got home from work. And I had to be prepared to discuss 2 articles that I had chosen. And I flash forward, I'm now White House press secretary. My parents have divorced. I haven't been in touch with my dad all that much. We're friendly, but he hadn't come to the White House. We're almost at the end. It's October of 2008. And my husband, who we've talked about already, maybe you don't know, he's British. But now he's an American citizen, but he was born in Britain. Oh, yes, we should give him a hand. Yeah. Those who choose to be Americans are very, very special people. So Peter loves any American event. Okay? It doesn't matter, football game, baseball, you want to go down the Statue of Liberty, the smallest thing, but being at the White House was a big deal. And we're getting towards the end. And there's a dinner for Prime Minister Berlusconi. And the Italian Americans, Perino, were part of the crew that were being invited to the dinner. And I said to Peter, I think I should invite my dad. And to my delight, my dad says yes. So Peter gets him a ticket, gets him a tux. My dad grew up on a ranch, right? He's never worn a tux before. This is going to be a big deal. We're in the middle of a financial crisis, though, and I didn't want to bother the president about it. The president knows me very well. And one day we get on that helicopter. I knew where to sit by this point. And when you walk out, when a president walks out onto the South Lawn, there's usually greeters people to say, wish you well and when you arrive and take off. So there's all these people there, and he gets on the chopper, and he's looking out the window, and he's waving, and he says, "So, I see you invited your dad to the White House." I said, "Yes, sir, I did." And he's still waving out the window, and he said, "That's a pretty big deal." I'm like, "Yes, sir, it is." And just as we were passing the Washington Monument, he looked right at me and said, "And I am so proud of you." Well, 2 weeks later, when my dad got there, it's pretty overwhelming. The first person we see when we walk in is Anthony Scalia. And then there's Justice Alito, and Peter Pace, General Pace, Rudy Giuliani. And they're all giving me hugs, and, "Oh, that's so great to see you, Dana." And it's kind of overwhelming. And we're in line to get our picture. And the military aide goes to introduce us, and the president stops and says, "Hold on, I know who this is. That's Leo Perino. And we have been waiting for him for years." And the interesting thing about that, and I believe Ronald Reagan had this ability as well, and I know that H.W. Bush had it, and I think President Obama might have it too. President Bush knew exactly what I needed at that moment as a staffer that was personal, but that helped me do my job better. Right? So he takes my dad off my hand, says, "You want to meet Condi? You want to?" And he takes him to see the Cheneys, and I didn't see him for 2 hours. But I really credit President Bush with helping me get my relationship back with my father.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Let's shift gears a little, Dana. Did you now you are a star on the 5. Did you
Let's
ever?
make sure we tell Greg Gutfeld that.
Yeah. How did that happen? Now, you went from the White House and bang, there you are on TV every day. Is it something you ever envisioned, and how are you liking it?
Okay, this is a funny story. This is on video, so I'm going to say it anyway, even though he might not like it. Well, he might like it, I don't know. So when I was a kid and I did the newspaper thing, when I got a little bit older, my family would have a meeting on Saturday to decide which church service we were going to go to on Sunday, the 8:30 or the 11. And I would always argue for the 8:30, which would irritate my sister. But if we went to the 8:30, we could do that and Sunday school and be home in time for Meet the Press. And because we were in Colorado, the shows were staggered when they came on, so you could watch Meet the Press, and then you could make it in time to watch the panel on This Week. And George F. Will was on the panel, and that's what I wanted to do. But then things change, right? You go through the quarter-life crisis and all these things. And in another example of me trying to plan out my life, in June of 2011, I had gone to Africa. I was serving on the Broadcasting Board of Governors for President Obama. I had been to Nigeria and a couple other places, Ethiopia, and our goal was to try to expand some American broadcasting, especially for women in Africa. And on the way home, I made this whole life plan. It was beautiful. It had okay, this is how much time I'm going to spend at work, and I had my own business at the time, and I had 2 employees. I was thinking of maybe adding 1 more. I was a little bit overwhelmed with as many clients as I had, so I thought, well, I'm going to see if I could do 1 more by the end of the year, and then Peter and I will spend Fridays in Annapolis, and I'll do this, and I had this whole plan. And I land at Dulles Airport, and I get to baggage claim, and my phone rings, and it's John Finley of Fox News, who worked on the Hannity show at the time, and he said, "We were wondering if you would come up just for 6 weeks this summer on this show that we have to use as a fill-in after the Beck Hour. We're going to call it The 5. And I said, "But I don't live in New York because it's not part of my plan." I hang up, and I call Peter, who I think was in Korea, and of course, I don't care what time it is there. I just call at 1 o'clock in the morning. And I tell him, I said, "Peter, oh my gosh, the Fox, they want me to come up for 5 weeks, and it's like in the middle of the summer, and we had all these plans." And he says, "Congratulations." And he said, "This is what you always wanted to do." And he was right. So I do write, though, about how it took me a while to come out of my shell. Maybe some people still think I'm in there, but I was hesitant because up until that moment, when I went on the 5, I had never given my personal opinion in public about anything. I was very comfortable speaking for the President of the United States of America. That was fine. But when you ask me personally how I feel about X, Y, or Z, and I had to think about how I would say that where I wouldn't offend anybody or start a world war, I mean, I have no responsibilities at all now except for myself. And that is something I concluded in the book, is that I truly believe that civility is a choice. So every time I open my mouth, I have a decision to make. I can be civil or not. And sometimes Juan Williams pushes me to the point that I am not. And I'll be sure to let him know how you feel. But I remember there was the person who really helped me do that, in some ways it's Roger Ailes, okay? So he gives me a chance to see, does she have a personality? But it was Greg Gutfeld who would make me laugh so much. And then Greg and I get along great. You know why we sit together on the 5? It's not because they thought, oh, they're going to be like brother and sister. We're the shortest. And so in order to balance out the table and the shot, we sat together. But it turns out to work really well. And then Kimberly and I have this great, funny relationship. We can, go at Bob Beckler or Juan Williams or whoever's there. And Eric Bolling has got all this experience with business and the economy. And the show is a juggernaut. And I didn't think it would be like a full-time job, but it really is. It takes you all day to sort of think, well, if you can think of, if you take the 5, you have 5 segments, about 7.5 minutes each. Well, in about 4 minutes, those last segments are 4 minutes long, and you have 5 people, very opinionated people who have something to say. You have to figure out how can you say something in 30 seconds that is going to matter. And I love that challenge, and so it's been terrific, and it turns out the 5 is the longest time I've ever held a job. Can you believe that? 4 years.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question, and I'd like to throw it open to the audience. How do you prepare for the show each day? Is it meticulously, everyone working through a rehearsal and all the rest of that, or no, it's far looser than that?
Oh, no, we can't stand each other. I'm kidding. We all get along great, but we don't talk during the day. We used to have a conference call at 10:30, and everybody would get on the call, and we'd talk about what was going to be on the show, and we would get so irritated with Bob that I'd be mad for 4 hours before I even got to the show. So the producer, Porter Berry, he stopped the phone call. And now what happens is there's an email pitch thread that starts at 6:01 every night after the show, and you send in your ideas, okay? And sometimes I lobby, right? I'm like, I think this story would be good. I like to produce a show. I'm like, this story would be good, and I do a lot of research. I like the rolling research. Sometimes it's a stretch for me. On the pop culture stuff, I'm not great. I have to really kind of think it through. I'm great at sports, which has actually become kind of funny on the show. So I read a lot, and Peggy Noonan taught me something that William Safire taught her, which is you are not wasting time. It's not a luxury to read. Reading is what allows you to be able to think so that you can be able to do your craft or your work. So I read a ton, and then I walk. New York is great for walking, and the only time I actually have a great thought is when I'm moving. So I walk to work most days, unless I have a cutoff. 40 degrees and below, I'll take the subway. So this winter, I was on the subway a lot. And then I'll call people. So I'm really good friends with some former Bush administration people. Sometimes if I really need her, I can call Condi Rice. But typically I have various people. I have some people at McConnell's office. I know the Boehner people. I have other friends that I've met along the way. I'd like to call my friend Kathleen Allen in Lincoln, Nebraska, and say, well, what do you think of this? And there's always a different kind of perspective, and that informs all of my thinking, and it goes through the grinder and comes out at 5 o'clock.
Very neat, very neat. Let's go to the real world here. Let's see. If you've got a question, as you can see standing up now, all around you are folks with microphones.
They just popped up.
There you go. I think we got one right here, Allison. Oh, great.
I'm old and not used to social media, but you made a comment. We're doomed. From the New York Times.
Yeah.
Was that carbon tax?
No. I was at a hotel yesterday morning, and I got a free New York Times. So I read the whole thing. And I would just say the liberal point of view is pervasive throughout the entire paper. It's not just on the editorial page. It's not just on the Sunday styles. I mean, every single article. And as I read it, that's where the media, the mainstream media, gets a lot of its ideas, and they all read the New York Times. They read other things too. But in reading the New York Times, I realized that for a conservative, I felt like we're doomed. You know enough about social media that you saw that. And nobody I'm traveling with even knew that I had said that. But I did. I think it's very difficult in this environment and demographically for conservatives to have a voice in the media. They complain about Fox News so much. Let me just tell you, as a former White House press secretary, every other media outlet will not have a conservative viewpoint that they will take seriously. And I've been able to command some respect from them, like their willingness to listen, because I think that, as what John was describing, it's a little bit of its tone. Some people might think I'm such a squish on X or Y. Truthfully, if you listen to what I say, it's very conservative, but it's cloaked in language that is persuasive. But there's not that many people out there doing it. So that's why I felt like we're doomed, but we're really not. But you know what I mean.
Okay, over here to the center.
I came here to ask you one question, and I adore you.
Where's
but
my
when
dog?
Pardon?
I thought you were going to ask me about my dog.
No. The other dog. When are we getting Bob Beckel back? Because Juan Williams makes me so angry, and Bob Beckel makes me laugh. And I miss him terribly, so he needs to get back.
Well, yes, as you know, he had extensive back surgery, and he's been trying to get better. I love Juan, and but here's part of the thing. One of the reasons I love him is, if you read chapter 6, it's about civility lost and found. One of the great things about Juan Williams is that, and about Bob and Julie Baginski, whoever is occupying that seat, they'll say it's 4 against 1. Well, sometimes it's 1 against 4. And it takes all we've got in order to beat it back. But in an instant, Juan will forgive. So our commercial breaks are not full of tension. Not always, very rarely. Sometimes they're just hilarious. And I'm also very fond of Juan for another reason. He has raised 2 great conservative boys. I'm telling you, keep an eye on Rafi Williams. He works at the RNC right now. This kid could be White House press secretary. I'd hire him in an instant.
That's great. Down here in the middle.
Your book is about guidance and advice. I'd be quite interested in hearing what you might have to offer for the Republican presidential candidates.
Oh, if I could just get my hands on some of them. Well, if I had a chance right now, what would I say to them? Part of it is that they're kind of in a hurry. They didn't have great rollouts in March and April because they were too fast out of the gate. And they hadn't thought through, why do they want to be president of the United States? What is it that they hope to accomplish? They need to come here to this library for some quiet time, walk through the whole thing, read the materials, watch the videos, and especially that last video. Like, why do you want to be the leader of this nation? One of the things I think that they have to realize, and that everyone in this room has to realize, is that in the Electoral College, you have to get to 270 votes. And immediately, you take California and New York off the table. Okay, so the pie is getting smaller and smaller. So I would ask all of them, Which one of you can flip a blue state? And convince me why. I also think in some ways that they have to take a step back. This idea that you have to be on cable TV all the time, or you got to be on Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat, you're going to have people to do that, and you're going to have to trust them. The president has to stay up here. They cannot get down too far in the weeds. So I have lots of advice for them. I'm not going to work for any of them, but I watch with great interest and prayers.
We'll go over here, and then we'll go upstairs.
Okay.
Dana, I'm going to ask you a question. If you don't want to touch it, that's fine.
Okay.
I happened to work as a staffer for Prescott Bush from 53 to 57, so I got to know him and his wife Nancy very well. Wonderful family. I was a Democrat at the time, by the way.
Were you 10?
What's that?
Were you 10 years old?
I wish.
You don't look old enough to have done that, but
Yeah.
okay.
But anyway, they were a wonderful family, and they treated us like, we were part of his staff, which we were, but I was just a staffer, running errands.
Junior Birdman.
Right. But I didn't get to know H.W. He had just left and gone to Texas, and of course, W was born in Texas. My question is going to be that since I knew Press and Nancy very well, and they're just wonderful people, and then we ended up with W, which, in my opinion, I did get an opportunity to go to the White House a few times during his administration, but as far as I'm concerned, what little I know about him is very similar to his grandfather, in terms of personality and how he cares for people. What bothers me is that amongst my Republican friends, I've made no bones about the fact that I would support Jeb Bush. And the question comes up, yeah, but he's got to put up with W's background. And I say, tell me what's wrong with W? He had a great morals, great ethics, everything. So I guess my question is, what is it about some Republicans that have negatives about W?
Well, I think some of it they would say is meritorious from their perspective. I think that they get frustrated with some of the spending that took place during those terms. Of course, there's justifications for all sorts of different things. And in Congress, I think that the end of the earmarks is probably one of the most important things that happens later on. I think that the fact that Iraq and Afghanistan go badly until the surge, and they get put back together, but it was late in coming. I also think, frankly, that to say that you're against George W. Bush is fashionable. Okay, it's a popular thing to say. It's harder to say that he was a man of great character who led the nation after the worst attack from terrorists and set our nation on a footing to be able to fight an ideology that we will be fighting for a generation, whether the current occupant of the White House doesn't want to talk about that or not. That is true. One of the reasons I wanted to write the book is so that people could see on the character side of things. One thing that I think is important in the Civility Lost and Found chapter is to find common ground with people. And I'll tell you a little funny story about Obama. When I was deputy press secretary, Senator Obama had just been elected in Illinois. He comes to Washington, and we go to this dinner called the Gridiron Dinner. And actually, there's a funny little costume that Nancy Reagan wore at the Gridiron Dinner. It's a kind of a fun night with the press. There are some. And I sit down at my table, USA Today, and across the table from me sits the junior senator from Illinois, Barack Obama. And he is like talk of the town. Everyone's excited. And Barack Obama has just got elected. He's had the big convention speech. And we sat down, and for 4 hours, we laughed our butts off. He took me over to meet Michelle Obama. We had all this great time. And I come home, and Peter said, "How was your night?" I said, "It was really good. I got to meet Barack Obama, the new senator from Illinois. And I got to tell you, Peter, I think he could be president in like 20 years. 3 years later, I was the press secretary. We're in the middle of a financial crisis. Obama comes to the White House. He's with McCain. I was the last person to file into the cabinet room. And I went to introduce myself, because I didn't expect him to remember me. I said, "Hello, sir, and he said, "Dana Perino." And he wraps me in this big hug. And I said, "Oh, sir, you might not remember." And he interrupts me again and says, "Not remember? That was my favorite night in all of Washington." And I sat down, and the deputy chief of staff leaned over and he said, "What was that all about?" And I said, "I'll tell you later, but I just might vote for him too." I didn't. But the reason I tell that story is for, at least in Washington, I had a very positive experience. And one of the reasons I did is I followed the example of George H.W. Bush and his son, George W. Bush, and how they treated people, met people, and served the national interest, not their self-interest. And all of us are humans.
We'll go up here to the top of the stairs.
Hi, my name is Nick Doom. That's my real last name, and Chrissy wanted me to say my name up here. And I teach history, and I show episodes of The West Wing, once in a while, segments, and I'm curious, how accurate is that show? And when you were as press secretary, did you have any familiarity with reporters being nice to you as press secretary?
A problem with them being nice to me?
No, were there any nice to you
Oh,
in that press corps you dealt with every day?
got it, thank you.
And how accurate was that show portraying your job?
I love this question about The West Wing, the show. It's so popular all around the world, and I loved it too. There's a whole generation of young people, we're not so young anymore, that watched The West Wing and then wanted to go to Washington to do good. Hopefully people aren't watching The House of Cards and want to go to Washington to do bad. I felt that The West Wing did an excellent job of portraying what it was like to try to get legislation passed. And, you know, of course there's a little bit of drama, and it's 42 minutes without the commercials. But there is one thing that I think it got drastically wrong. And I was telling that Mike Lanska, who's the docent who took my friends and my husband and I around today, I told him that there's a photograph, especially when John Hinckley shot President Reagan, there's a picture of the Secret Service trying to get Reagan back into the limo. I saw Rob Lowe about 6 months ago at O'Reilly's show, and we're in the green room, and he asked me the same question. Rob Lowe wanted to know, did you think the show was accurate? So I said, yes, I thought it was, except for you guys missed a really important part. When President Bartlett would get out of a car, out of the limo, the Secret Service, they'd open the door, out came the president and headed into wherever he was going, and you would always see the Secret Service and shut the door behind him. That never happens. And this was true after Ronald Reagan was shot. They leave the door open in case the president has to get put back in. So that was a little detail that they missed. I love the White House press corps. I can't believe I'm admitting it, but I did. There were some annoyances, right? There were some annoying things. You'll read something in the book that is totally out of character for me, but I used to do under the podium for like one person. I just say that I use the verb peacocking around for a reason. For those of you who can figure out, you know who I'm talking about. Look, I think the people in the White House press corps tried to be very fair. I would say that their editors, their headline writers, their assignment desk, all the other things that surrounded them, I think led to some bias. But as Republicans, one piece of advice that I would give them is you can't complain about bias against Republicans in the media. You just got to live with it, factor it in, have more facts, be more persuasive, be more kind. Reach out to them more. I always felt the press secretary's job was 50-50. 50% defending and advocating for the President of the United States, and the other 50% defending and advocating for the right of the press to have access to the President. And I was with some reporters the other day. They're complaining about lack of access in the Obama White House. And I said, well, as soon as you ceded ground to the government, you're not going to get it back. And so stop ceding ground to the government and make sure that you are relevant. The press corps, to me, I have a lot of great friends. Can I say one bad word? I talked to a great friend of mine. I won't tell you who he is. He worked at the White House for a long time. He's now an editor for one of the wire services. And he called me to congratulate me on the book. And I said, well, have you read it yet? And he said, no, but it's on my desk, and I think about it every day. And I said, oh, good, I'm glad I'm on your to-do list. And he said, well, you're also on my board. He said, it's an email that you sent to me on July 5th of 2008. I says, what does it say? It says, you're being an ass, and you can quote me on that. But that's the kind of relationship that we had. I would say that if I had to look back, I would just say it was very positive for me.
Great, great. In the center here.
Your boss, President Bush, has been very dignified in not commenting on the current administration. And on the 5, I find you're trying to be as dignified as possible also to not comment on the press organization in the current administration. Mm-hmm. But there have to be times you look at the TV and you go, what in the heck are they thinking? Yeah. Where do you draw the line? How do you draw the line on what would be legitimate commentary from somebody whose opinion we really want? Yeah. And what you feel is the dignity of that office, that you represented?
I do love the office of the press secretary and what it means, because for the 50-50 description I just had. There's also a wonderful fraternity, little club of former press secretaries. And last Monday night, I was in Chicago at the Institute of Politics with Robert Gibbs and Joe Lockhart and David Axelrod and me. I just said, well, I know I look better than all of you. I had that going for me. But we get along great for a lot of reasons. Part of it is that I am hesitant to criticize, often because I think the press secretary, he is, or she, but in this case he, they're dealing with a bad set of facts. And the press secretary's office doesn't create the facts. That comes from higher up. They also have a responsibility, though, on tone. And one of my piece of advice for all young people, not just those in politics, is that this is what I would imagine. If I were at the White House podium, I would think about, is President Bush watching me right now? And if he wasn't going to be proud of something I was about to say, then I didn't say it. I swallowed a lot of sarcasm. The press secretary's position, you're powerful. You can make people look very stupid. But President Bush required us to treat the press as if they were in his living room. And so we turned a lot of cheeks. And sometimes professionally, I wondered about if we were hurting him by following that lead. I now know, years later, that he was right. You see the poll last week that showed that now he's more popular than Obama? I'm like, that gotta hurt. And I emailed 43 and I said, it's all due to this new book. I will say this is where I drew the line. On Benghazi, when the White House lied about who pushed the video, that got to me, because not only were they lying, especially to the victims' families, but their instinct was to blame free speech. That was the instinct. They perp walked a guy in the middle of the night for a parole violation for something he didn't do. And that is where I drew the line. I thought that that was really wrong, and I think that history will prove me right, unfortunately. I don't want to be proven right on that, but I think I will be.
We've got time for one last question. Before we take it, just a little bit of housekeeping. Dana has been nice enough to agree to stick around afterwards to sign many, many books. So we need to get her up there kind of quick. So if you could, when we finish with this last question, just remain in your seats, and Dana will exit out this way, and we'll get her signing as quickly as we can. If we could go over here for the one last question.
Oh, you better make it a good one. This is a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Back to the 5. The question I really have, you said you and Greg Gutfield had a good relationship. When he introduces you on the 5, do you know what he's going to be saying?
No.
It's always a shock.
So for those of you who don't know, or those of you who do, that watch the 5, we take turns every day. Somebody else leads the show. When Greg leads the show, when he introduces me, he always says something like, she surfs on a tongue depressor. She rafts on a Triscuit. Something sort of funny. I never know what it is, but I love it. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Just great. Thank you, Dana. Just great.
Thank you.